Okay, let's see if we get any better picture quality here. That looks better, much better. Okay, that looks better. Okay, Dorian, you're back. Does this look good now? And can you hear me? Is the volume good? I'm going to roll right back to what I said earlier, is that I'm going to wait for people to come on board. Most people catch these things in replay, and I understand that, especially with me, where it's so challenging to be able to notify people. Yeah, I don't know what was going on earlier. That was really weird. What you're going to see, again, initially I thought I would be able to do this all as one broadcast, but it became quite apparent to me as I began assembling and sorting my data, information, and sources, which is critical, okay, because I know immediately when I put this information out there that the establishment apologists are going to come at me hard and are going to try to tear me apart, and they're going to try to use things like conspiracy theory and all of these things to debunk what I'm going to present to you. So I need to anticipate these people ahead of time. I should say that when I was in university, I was what you might call a crash test dummy for aspiring system apologists all the way through university. I was anti-establishment when I was in university. I was mad as hell at the world, and I thought our system was completely corrupt. And all the way through university, I sort of carried that chip on my shoulder. And I became what I would argue as a fairly skilled debater and critic of the establishment. So those who were aspiring to be part of the establishment would use all their ridiculous establishment apologizing arguments on me. And if they could get it past me, they knew that they were onto something. So this is old hat for me. And so I brought this old talent with me into this debate. And as I go further and further into this topic, it gets more and more complicated all the time. I have been certainly in the media, I would say, limited and identified as an anti-SOGI 123 critic. Like, that's all I'm about, is I'm against SOGI 123. Those who have heard my presentations know that I'm about much more than that, okay? Because I believe what's going on with the transgender agenda to not only be destructive to women's rights and highly destructive to our most vulnerable children, but I believe it to be part of a broader, bigger macro agenda, if you will, that is ultimately, when you start looking at the fine details of it, and nuts and bolts, extraordinarily dangerous. Okay, and I touched on this in my Synanon essay, and I wrote my Synanon essay, and it's sort of working thesis at that time. Very shortly after I got into this debate, many of my excuse me, arguments that I used at that time and theories, I think, are still valid, but I've learned so much. I mean, at that time, I was really just an academic and a researcher, and sort of stumbled into this debate, knowing that I had to take it on, but still trying to, read the lay of the land and, learn to deal with all the different actors and parties involved in this. And I was not at that time actively involved in trying to affect government policy, for instance. Now, of course, that's all changed, and I've had, a whole lot of Well, I've been through an adventure. People should check out my 6 months of madness video if you want to get a taste of what I've been going through. So, yeah, this is going to be an interesting topic. Still waiting for people to show up. Like I say, it became clear to me that this topic was too big to cover in one broadcast, so I'm going to break it up into hopefully just two broadcasts. So this week and next week, I've just got so much data to support my arguments, and it all needs to be presented. And even though this is going to take me two broadcasts to do, you should know that what you are seeing is essentially a preview of a much bigger project that I'm working on that will have much more data, and I'm going to be releasing it in the form of a written essay, much like my Synanon essay, and it's going to also be released as a video. I've been tinkering with video. I was hoping I would have people who are experts in this assisting me, but as is usual in my journey, it seems just as I get on the brink of something, everything sort of blows apart. See how many people we got now. We got 9 people, you know. So while I'm still waiting for people to come on board, I wanted to start tonight by addressing some issues and topics that have come up over the last couple of days or so, just to give you my perspective for whatever that's worth. It has to do with, and it was sort of triggered by what appears to be the breakup of the Freedom Free-for-All gang, and some of the key elements of that group pulling out of the Freedom Free-for-All project. Now, my initial understanding was that Freedom Free-for-All was gone, poof, no more. But it looks like Josh, who was the host, is going to try to keep it going, although that's going to be quite a challenge for him because he's going to need a new studio, and their previous broadcasts were really a team effort, and it's going to be difficult for him to do it on his own. But I do most everything on my own too, so maybe they can pull it off. But this has generated an awful lot of conversations between myself and people locally. I should say that the Freedom Free-for-All gang that many of you are familiar with, I know some people don't like some of their viewpoints and stuff, and I would say that I don't agree with everything that they say. But I think that disagreement is a sign of a healthy, functioning democracy. So I allow people to have different views than me. When they start getting into dangerous views, like say the views that James Cantor or Oren Amate or some of these people, Camille Paglia, put out there, that's a different story. I'll get really aggressive with these people. But if people just have, you know, sort of other general things that we disagree on, I allow that. Okay, so I get along pretty well with Adam. I think Adam from Freedom Free-for-All, or formerly of Freedom Free-for-All, is a good guy, and he's been extraordinarily helpful to me. My video, high-quality video that I put together calling for inquiries into what's happening with foster children would not have happened without Adam's input, and I will be forever grateful to him for assisting me. And he's assisted me in other ways too. He's very sort of, you might call a little big man. He's not big in stature, but he's got a big presence and he's fearless. And so he's helped over this, over the course of this year by going into some of these crazy crowds that follow me and getting some raw footage and sort of confronting them at the street level. And he's been very useful in that regard. So again, very thankful for him and other members of the Freedom Free-for-All team who were there with me in Victoria almost from the start, pretty much from when I did my Oak Bay talk. Josh was there, and Max, I believe, was there, and others as well. And they've They've been very helpful to me. So it's very disappointing to me that they would be breaking up. But there's been a lot of chatter over the last day or two about that, and it's raised some questions that I wanted to address briefly here while I'm still waiting for people to come on board. So again, this is just my perspective, and people can take that or leave it. So one of the things that comes up is on the whole issue of facing enormous, what I call the twin demons of power and complacency, right? So the power of the establishment and the complacency of the people. And nobody understands the dangers of these two things, I think, better than I do at this stage in my political activist career. So we've got a question here that when you're faced with what seems like insurmountable odds, like this powerful sort of Lord of the Rings Sauron type establishment that seems like something that can't be defeated. Plus, you've got a public that is very fickle and for the most part doesn't care. And even those who do care, you have to kind of keep tasering them figuratively to keep them active, involved, and caring, because it's maybe understandable that people just want to live their lives, right? And when you see something like what we're dealing with now in society, it's pretty easy just to sort of want to give up. So I understand that. Now, what I want to do here is I got into an exchange with somebody on this issue of giving up or forging ahead. I'm not going to say who it was that I got into this exchange with, but I sent them a message, and I'm going to read that for you verbatim. Some of you sort of heard a bit of this from me before, but I think it's worth bringing up again. And again and again and again, because people, I think, need to keep being reminded. And it also will help people sort of understand who I am and what sort of has kept me going for so long. Because I've been in this debate now for 2 going on 3 years, and it hasn't been easy to keep on forging ahead, but I do it anyway. So here's the message that I sent. The other side of this debate has frequently enjoyed laughing at me and telling me that everything is too entrenched and that I don't stand a chance in hell of changing anything, and that it is a joke that I even bother trying, and it makes me look like a pathetic figure. When they said this to me, I responded by saying, well, that's the difference between you and me. I don't do what I do because I expect to win. I do what I do because it's the right thing. And I plan to go to my grave doing the right thing. And if I end up in a ditch by the side of the road, homeless and penniless, or buried in a shallow grave, or at the bottom of the Fraser River with cement shoes, it won't matter. All that will matter is that 1 or 2 or a few stood against incredible odds and refused to surrender that which they knew was right. But finding victory in defeat is a very difficult task, and I understand this intimately, because it requires a kind of resolve and faith that few people will ever possess or even understand. Almost everybody I have aligned with in this struggle has either sold out, in my opinion, or disappeared. It is only my faith in a higher power that keeps me from thinking that my critics are right. And then I put in a couple of Latin sentences, and those who are Latin aficionados, excuse my Latin. Horribilis est locus ist, spes mea in Deo est, which loosely translates to, This is a horrible place to be, but my faith is in God. And with that last note there, okay, I want people to be very careful because everybody wants to keep labeling me a right-wing religious bigot. I am not religious. I am one of the most faithful people you will discover on this planet in terms of a belief in a higher power, but I don't subscribe to any doctrine. I'm not a Christian. I don't practice any religion. So I want people to be clear about that. But it is my faith in a higher power in this universe that I've seen it work in my life that keeps me going. To understand where my faith comes from, I typically like to quote Carl Jung, who was asked if he believed in God. And I think he really nailed it there and sort of expresses what I think about that. An interviewer for W5, I think it was, asked him if he believed in God. And he said, well, you know, it's difficult for me to answer. And he kind of chewed on his pipe for a second. And then he said, I would say, no, I don't believe in God. I know God exists because you don't need to believe in something that you have a relationship with. And that's sort of me and my sort of view on things and why I have a powerful faith. But I don't want people to confuse me and think that I'm, you know, a dogmatic Christian or into religion and stuff. I don't criticize people who follow that path, but it's not my path. When I wear crosses, which I always do, which my enemies have pointed to over and over again, this is not a symbol of the Christian religion to me. This is a symbol of a higher power in the universe, a higher power that has infused, in my opinion, the Christian religion, because I believe wherever people go looking for God, in whatever form they try to express that in the world, God will be there and will infuse itself into the narrative somewhere. That doesn't make, you know, it doesn't say that the Christian dogma is flawless. I'm not going to suggest that, or any other religion. So that's what that's all about, and that's what sort of keeps me going. Not everybody has this faith in a higher power, and it's has been difficult for me in the course of this struggle because, like I said, I've been in it for a long time, and I have sort of a ruthless, unshakable dedication to that which I think is right. And as I've said before, everybody wants somebody who will not back down on what they think is right until they believe something that they disagree with, and then suddenly nobody wants anything to do with you anymore. That's sort of me. So along the way in this struggle, as I noted in that message that I sent, almost everybody that I've worked with, I'm not going to specify any names that this applies to or doesn't apply to, but almost everybody of note has either sold out or has given up. I'm still going. Others in this debate have aligned with the establishment, and they have subsequently gotten themselves platformed by the establishment. Whereas I, who refuses to align with a corrupt system, am ignored and left behind, and I would argue deliberately kept down. I'm hoping that at some point that I, and more importantly, the arguments that I carry, will at some point in time reach the status of the infamous stone that was rejected by the builders. Right? So I'm just going to keep on sticking with it. What we struggle against is not an easy thing. And I knew it would not be easy from day one. And to be honest, I actually believed from day one that this struggle would probably mark the end of me, because I knew my nature and I knew what I was going up against. And it feels at this stage like I've been in this battle for almost 100 years. But, I mean, obviously the struggle against the powerful is never easy, because the powerful are powerful. It just goes with the territory. Now, on the issue of most people not caring and complacency, let me just say that I get it. Okay, I've been doing this, like I say, going on 3 years now, and I've been battling that constantly, and I'm sliding into debt because of not getting enough support. Part of that has to do with censorship about the establishment too. But people should know and understand that historical changes against tyrannical power were never achieved by the majority. It was always a dedicated few, usually driven by a stubborn, fearless leadership that refused to give up and who were ultimately willing to die for their cause. This, I think, was best exemplified in the 20th century by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So what I want to do is I want to take a moment here to play a brief video clip of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, because their message is timeless. And while they were addressing the issues of the Black community, ultimately they were human beings, first and foremost. And Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, I think, sort of exemplified the power that is required and the dedication that is required to stand up against systemic oppression. And that is what we're seeing. And these messages that I'm about to play are timeless. So let me just bring that up for you. Give me a second. That's not working. So here we go. Oops, wrong one. Hang on. How did I get that one? There we are. Hang on a second.
We aren't a violent group. We are taught to obey the law, to respect everyone who respects us. We're taught to display courtesy, to be polite. But we're also taught that at any time, anyone in any way inflicts or seeks to inflict violence upon us, we reserve the right to defend ourselves. So to accuse us of being violent is like accusing a man who is being lynched, who is being hung on a tree, simply because he struggles vigorously against his lyncher. The victim is accused of violence, but the lyncher is never accused of violence. This is a sort of a propaganda tactic, or what I would call psychological warfare. To me, one of the things that the Birmingham incident brought to light is the lack of fear in the Negro community. Our people in this country have been held in check more by fear than anything else. Today, that fear is gone.
Now, what is your reaction when people refer to the black Muslims as a, quote, extremist or hate group?
Well, extremists, the condition that black people suffer in this country is extremely bad. And it takes an extreme remedy to correct an extreme condition. That's why the moderates can't do it. That's why the conservatives can't do it. We are extremely angry over the plight of our people. And we know that it's going to take some extreme actions to correct this plight. The time will come when any people and all people on this earth will develop enough intelligence to know that they are within their rights to do whatever is necessary to protect themselves. We're born at a time, and we live in an era when no oppressed people will be satisfied to let the oppressor continue to oppress them without doing something about it. And as the oppressed awaken and become very eager to defend themselves, the oppressor himself is going to step up his activities.
you feel that your message, apparent message of love that you brought back from Islam is the real reason they're after you, because you're not hating as hard as they want you to?
Well, I never did hate anybody hard. As long as I represented the Black Muslim movement as an example of morality, unity, and militancy. As long as I could do that, I represented it. It was when I realized that it could not be represented as that I came on and started working among the non-Muslim Negroes, as I announced in January.
Why are they threatening your life?
Well, primarily because they're afraid that I will tell the real reason that that I'm out of the Black Muslim movement, which I never told. I kept to myself. And I had stated in a newspaper article about an effort to take my life back in January, and at that time the Muslims denied it. In fact, they tried to make it appear to my brother that I was insane. But on a program in Chicago called Hotline, that's moderated by Wesley South, John Ali, the national secretary, admitted, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, one of these days last week, that they absolutely were going to kill me.
You get out of
What will you take to protect yourself from this threat?
Sound is working, is it?
I have a rifle. If anybody comes to my house without a good reason, I intend to try and use it, and that's all.
right now?
No, I don't worry. I'll tell you, I'm a man who believed that I died 20 years ago, and I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear whatsoever of anybody or anything.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay, so that is some sort of timeless, powerful words from people in the past who had to stand up against an oppressive system that wanted to smash them. And in both those cases, of course, they were ultimately assassinated. I've always sort of related to what Malcolm X said there in the one clip about feeling like he was already dead and living like a man that's already dead. I've said before in other places that I always sort of found a deep wisdom in the final words of Abigail Folger, who was one of the Manson family's unfortunate victims. Her final words were reported to be something along the lines of, "I'm already dead. I'm already dead." So that's where I am. I live like I'm already dead. And the only thing that sort of keeps me going is my dedication to attempting to try to restore sanity and justice to a society and a country that is being led astray by criminal elements in our society, using some of the methodologies that I'm going to start addressing and documenting tonight. I mean, I've already done some of that, but I'm taking it up to the next level now. But the thing is that I don't expect the average person to be willing to put it on the line like that. And it should be noted that I don't have a family or really anything to lose. And I've said before that the only thing I have to lose is everything. That's not very much. So I'm in a position to, adopt that sort of attitude. And because I'm in the position to do that, most people aren't, I believe I have a moral duty to sort of put it all on the line. But most people just want to live their lives, or they've got families and stuff, and they don't want to sort of surrender it all to go after what they believe in. So you have to sort of understand the dynamics of the world and understand that people are fearful for good reasons, and sometimes stepping out is the best thing for them to do. But those of us, right, the few that sort of get it and understand that we can make a stand, need to keep on standing and be prepared to stand for a long time, because it can take a long time to make changes. I remember listening to Noam Chomsky talking about growing the Vietnam War resistance movement, and how in the early days when he first began talking and campaigning to get the United States to pull out of Vietnam, how he spoke to audience after audience, in some cases with only 6 people in the room, right? And that they just had to sort of keep plugging away and plugging away and plugging away. And eventually they were able to grow this massive resistance movement. But it wasn't easy in its inception, and it took them many years to get people involved. So that's what I would say about the whole, do we give up or do we keep forging ahead? And what do we do when we encounter this wall of complacency from the public? My view is that we have to keep sort of forging ahead in whatever way we can. Again, different people will bring different things to the table and be willing to take risks within the circumstances of their life. So I personally at this stage refuse to give in. Okay, so let's get on here with some of the hard, detailed facts that I wanted to introduce people to. Sort of a long intro here, but like I say, these issues about giving up or forging ahead have been raised over the last couple of days, though, so I thought it was important to address it. So I've been working on assembling this data, and like I say, creating this project to hopefully enlighten people to what is going on in society and make people understand that one of the number one tools that is used by the establishment to silence the revelation of important truths is the term conspiracy theory. And much of what sort of is going on in the world today, I think, is beyond the ability of most people to even believe. Okay, so you look at Erich Fromm, who observed the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, and he said that that was one of the most difficult things, and ultimately the main thing that allowed the Nazis to come to power in Germany was the inability of the average person to even fathom that kind of oppressive, evil power was even possible, right? Anybody who suggested that this was going to be, what it was dismissed as sort of a crazy nut, and people just couldn't wrap their minds around it. So what I've seen is that you need to bring something extraordinary to be able to introduce people to extraordinary clips, ideas. And on that note, I'm going to play a clip here for you in a moment. And it's really designed to set a mood. And it's going to be a very sort of strange thing. But it's important, I think, and I've done it for a reason. I want you to, at this point, think about the topic at hand. So intelligence, the media, and totalitarianism, and how all of these things might link up. Now, once you've got that in your head, I'm going to need you all to put on your space helmets and sit back and get ready to take a little trip. I'm going to let that go for you right now.
Will you help me?
We are unable to transmit through conscious neural interference. You are receiving this broadcast as a dream. You are receiving this broadcast in order to alter the events you are seeing. Our technology has now developed a transmitter strong enough to reach a conscious state of awareness.
Okay, we've got a problem here. Hang on, Houston. We need to start it again. I don't know what happened there. Again, I'm still getting used to this software, so bear with me here. One more try.
Will you help me?
This is not a dream. Not a dream. We are using your brain's electrical system as a receiver. We are unable to transmit through conscious neural interference. You are receiving this broadcast as a dream. You are receiving this broadcast in order to alter the events you are seeing. Our technology has now developed a transmitter strong enough to reach your conscious state of awareness. You are receiving this broadcast in order to alter the events you are seeing. Tune in.
Attention. To help carry on our important work, I want you to join the secret squadron and wear this official badge and have this secret decoder. Following each week's adventure, I'll send an important secret message, and only secret squadron members who have decoders can decode them. Also, later I'll tell you the simple rules for joining the secret squadron, but you must promise to do as I do.
The television screen has become the retina of the mind's eye. The battle for the mind of North America will be fought in the video arena. The television screen is the retina of the mind's eye. Therefore, the television screen is part of the physical structure of the brain. Therefore, whatever appears on the television screen emerges as raw experience for those who watch it. Therefore, television is reality, and reality is less than television. Max, I'm so glad you came to me. I've been through it all myself, you see. Your reality is already half video hallucination. If you're not careful, it will become total hallucination. You'll have to learn to live in a very strange new world.
No matter what other rice cereal you've ever tried, you'll love Post Sugar Rice Burritos best of all. Honey and sugar make it different and wonderful. A circus of fun to eat.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Matrix. Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
Okay, welcome back, Space Cadets. So that's going to seem a little unusual to most people. And the reason that I tried or decided to start with something so very strange is because the topic that I'm addressing now is going to seem to most people to be very strange and perhaps even unlikely. So in true sort of elite establishment form, what I decided to do was to throw people way out there and then try to bring you back to this other topic that's not quite as strange, but maybe in many ways you might think that it is. So let me just move on to my next screen. If I can find it. There we go. Bear with me. This is why Freedom Free for All is going to have troubles, because to do things right, what you need is a team, and I'm a team of one. So here we go. Okay, so where was I? So I want to start by proposing a thesis, or a kind of Schrodinger's cat thought experiment with you all. But I'm going to frame it in a kind of political social engineering kind of a way. What if, and this is just a starting operating thesis, what if somebody was to suggest to you that the intelligence establishment and the media have become so closely knit and intertwined over the decades that it was now virtually impossible to separate the two, and that the latter had essentially been absorbed by the former, not in its physical totality, but in its effective operation? What if we were further to assume that much of what you see in the mainstream media, in all of its myriad modern manifestations, was essentially a very carefully constructed and controlled fake reality? What if those complaining about the creation of fake news were in fact employed full-time creating fake news and a kind of fake world to pull over your eyes? Now, I'm not going to suggest that this is actually the case. I'm just putting it out there as I said earlier, a thought experiment. But if we were to presume that such a thing could happen, how would we know it? How would we, as lowly plebeians, be able to detect it? Or would we be able to detect it at all? Now, in my sort of strange video clip that I played there, I included a scene from the movie The Matrix, which was created by the Wachowski brothers. The Wachowski brothers, I believe, if you look at the Matrix films and you look at the V for Vendetta and some of their other work, I believe were trying to send out clues to people about how the world we live in operates. But there's some other very strange things about the Wachowski brothers that most of you maybe don't know. So let me just go to another clip.
That it's beauty, it's genius. Billions of people just living out their lives, oblivious.
The peak of your civilization. I say your civilization because as soon as we started thinking for you, it really became our civilization, which is, of course, what this is all about. Evolution, Morpheus. Evolution. I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species. I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
Okay, so do you ever get the impression that somebody is messing with you? Somebody, maybe a whole lot of somebodies, are playing with your head? I get that impression all the time. Now, mind you, I'm a very sort of strange person. But I have been watching the media and our government very carefully for a very long time. And that has led me to a very strange place and some very strange conclusions. Now, as is typical with me, I don't just sort of pull conclusions out of my behind. When I come up with a theory, usually the theory, I've been led to the theory by observations of the world around me. And then in order to support that theory or thesis, I go out and I accumulate evidence for that. So that's what we're doing now. Now, I need to lay some groundwork and let you know sort of why I've chosen this topic and why I've chosen to sort of drag you all down the rabbit hole with me. And you're about to get sort of a hint at just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Let me explain. So I've been doing public speaking now. March will be 2 years that I've been doing public speaking. When I first started doing public speaking, I didn't encounter a whole lot of resistance. It wasn't until this year, really, when I decided to start speaking on my own instead of as part of a duo or a team, that I really encountered resistance. But what happened was that in my earlier speaking engagements, I kept sort of talking about the dangers that this whole transgender ideology posed to not only to women's rights, but to our most vulnerable children. And in the course of making my arguments and backing my arguments up, the other side of this debate sort of kept coming at me over and over and over and over again, saying well, the experts have decided that the transitioning of kids is the best thing to do, and you're not an expert, so you just need to shut up and listen to the experts. And again, they sort of came at me over and over again. I said, look, because I knew this from years of study and observation. I said that, you know, the experts aren't necessarily people that you should be trusting. Then, of course, they threw back at me the whole conspiracy theory thing. And this sort of came at me so much and so often that I eventually got pissed off. And I said, okay, so what I'm going to need to do now is I'm going to need to go out and I'm going to have to assemble quality evidence that's going to support my thesis that the experts driving this debate can't be trusted, okay? And we should be led by common sense first, right? I think it was Richard Feynman who said that whenever approaching, and one of the top scientists in history, who said that when approaching a problem, the first thing that you need to do is not refer to experts and expert opinions and stuff. The first thing you need to do is ask yourself if it makes sense. Okay, so that's where you know, I recommend everybody starts. And when all these experts are coming out and they're saying things that don't make any sense, that's going to be your clue to start maybe digging a little deeper. So what I did was that I went out and I collected all kinds of evidence that I think gave a powerful illustration and argument that the scientific pharmaceutical research complex and, of course, the pharmaceutical industry are completely corrupt and cannot be trusted. And we see the greasy, grubby paws of big pharma all over the science that these people are using to justify destroying the bodies of these children. So it was when I assembled all of this evidence sort of attacking the medical pharmaceutical complex, and when I added this sort of totalitarian angle to my talks, that's when I really started getting protests against me. Okay, so that was the whole erosion of freedom tour that I started on actually it started over here on the Lower Mainland, just me. I did talks in Maple Ridge and Hope, and then I went over to Vancouver Island, and that's when it really sort of blew up. Okay, and the whole sort of establishment came down upon me, and I would argue that one of the reasons that that happened was because I was attacking sacred cows, if you will. So the pharmaceutical complex and the idea that our government might be engaging in traditionally totalitarian behavior patterns. But I think I established my case very well. So what's happened is that I've sort of been maneuvered into the same position again. So I have said over and over again, looking at the way everything is being covered, and not just by the left press, but by the right press, that our media is under control. Not only under control, but it is under state, or rather deep state control, or deep state / establishment control. Now, again, I sort of knew this from my years of researching propaganda, and when I was in university, I looked at some of the adventures of the Central Intelligence Agency in terms of facilitating the manipulation of minds and information around the world, and I knew that. But of course, when I say to people, and the hardest tends to be the people on the right, okay? Because when you see people like Tucker Carlson or Jordan Peterson coming out and saying all of these things that appear to be going against the establishment agenda, people are so desperate for somebody to say something that makes sense that they rush right on over to them. And I am a person who says, well, hold it a second. Who are these people? And what are they saying? Because I really think that the entire media establishment is corrupt and cannot be trusted on either side of the coin. And of course, people came at me with this conspiracy theory thing again, and that's just a wild conspiracy theory. And So I got into a situation again where I figured that I was going to have to assemble evidence to clarify for people that the idea that what they call the fourth estate, and I would extend that now into what's called the fifth estate, is not to be trusted. The fourth estate, which is supposed to be a watchdog for the people in terms of watching the government and the establishment, today, most of the time, has become more of a lapdog. That's at best. And occasionally, as I've discovered, certainly this year especially, they are turned into an attack dog for the establishment. And we have a real problem with our media today. So I need to clarify something for the viewers. And some of you have heard this before, but it is important that everybody come to understand what Noam Chomsky called the propaganda model, okay? Because that was my basic framework for understanding the media when I came into this debate, and I knew I was going to have to deal with it at some point. And I suspected that at some point I would have to deal with it in the way that I'm beginning to deal with it now. But I've had, or been able to sort of put that off for a long time. So I'm going to sort of describe for people in a very sort of general way what Noam Chomsky's propaganda model was, which he kind of wrote about in this book. I don't know if you can you see that? There. It's too bright, close to the camera. Manufacturing Consent. Okay, his propaganda model of the media is actually much more complex than I'm going to boil it down to. But there's really two key points in Chomsky's propaganda model, which basically says that the mainstream media is under more or less complete control, particularly and specifically in regards to agendas that the establishment regards as the most important. But there's sort of two main points in there that Chomsky touches on about how the media is controlled. And everybody needs to be aware of these. So the first form of control over the media is sort of the obvious overt editorial and ownership control. The second is what you could call filtering, conditioning, and selecting. Now, I'm going to be adding to this model a third and more sort of sinister element that I'm going to need to prove to you with a great deal of evidence. But let's start with point number one. Ownership is the most obvious control of the media. And I remember once Chomsky was asked about, what is all this stuff you're saying that the media is controlled? How is the media controlled? And Noam just kind of laughed and said, it's funny, people never come to me and ask how General Motors is controlled. It's controlled because, they own it. That's how the establishment controls General Motors, because they own it, right? But people don't seem to want to apply that to the media or the press. But of course, Chomsky did. And much like myself, I think Chomsky reached a point where he got sick to death of people saying that that was just a wild conspiracy theory. So he spent an awful lot of time in conjunction with his co-author, Edward Herman, assembling what I thought was a powerful case to prove his point that the media is under control. Part of that comes in understanding also that like when Chomsky talked about this, the problem wasn't actually as bad then as it is now. It's become far, far worse than it was when Chomsky first began talking about that. And one of the problems has to do with the concentration of mediaship or media ownership. So let's just take a look at that. I'm going to give you something here briefly from somebody I'm not a huge fan of, generally. But he has some good points here on, you can find it, concentration of the media. And this is Tim Pool.
In the early 1980s, roughly 50 different companies owned 90% of American media. By 1992, that number had dropped to less than 2 dozen. And in recent years, that same 90% has fallen to just 6 major conglomerates. Although various mergers and layers of external control make this an inexact number, most of the big 6 hold interests in film production, cable and broadcast television, news, sports, music, and online streaming.
Okay, so that just sort of briefly illustrates the problem of the consolidation of the media. So we need to look at this maybe a little more closely, though. So let's just do that. I think I'll need to go full screen on this one for you. Okay, so the illusion of choice in the media. So this is sort of referring to the United States there, and you can see that here they talk about 1983, that 90% of the media in the United States was controlled at that time by about 50 corporations. Fast forwarding to 2011, that had shrunk to just 6 corporations controlling 90% of what people read, watch, and listen to. And they sort of list the 6 different companies there. But it's getting even worse. Okay, so very recently we had 21st Century Fox buying, actually it was Disney buying 20th Century Fox. So it should sort of be understood here that we're talking about not just media, but we're talking about other forms of shaping the public mind. And propaganda has always relied on movies and entertainment and Hollywood to do that. So Walt Disney merged recently with 20th Century Fox, and the consolidation there is getting quite a bit worse. So here you can see, I believe it's about 77 or 78% of movies now are controlled by 6 companies. So this is becoming a problem. Now the question is, what about Canada? Is this just in the United States, or is this Canada as well? Well, yes, it's Canada as well. So here's one sort of analysis of the media that showed that there were 5 corporations in Canada who controlled 73.3% of the media in Canada. Okay, so the National Post, who has become a sort of a big player now and has recently taken Meghan Murphy under their wing, is sort of the ultimate, what I would call right-wing corporate media. Okay, and they control papers all across Canada that you can see there. Most of the sort of key newspapers there. You can see here the different major newspapers in Canada that Post Media controls. In British Columbia, I don't have all of the statistical breakdown on that, but in British Columbia, most of the newspapers are controlled by either Post Media or Black Press. Both Post Media and Black Press recently refused to publish ads for me. Okay, so that basically shut me out completely from being able to advertise in the press in British Columbia. That's kind of power that 2 corporations have. They can do a virtual blackout on somebody's ability to communicate. They're supposed to be facilitating communication, right? Facilitating advertising. But again, they're sort of a watchdog for the establishment right now. So that's the problem. Okay, so media has always been there's been an ownership management ability to control the media. So they can censor stories, they decide what's going to be censored. We saw this with the sarin gas story in the States, that reporters and stories can be axed by management at any time. But for the most part, that tends to be far too much work. Now, I should say that when we're talking about the media, another thing that we see commonly talked about today is people saying that this agenda, right, this agenda towards transing our kids and trampling women's rights and the increasing assault on freedom of speech is being waged by what Jordan Peterson calls the neo-Marxist postmodernists. But whether you're talking about the left media, right, or whether you're talking about the right media, these are all corporations, okay? And they are run by ruthless, sociopathic, hardcore capitalists who hate Marxists, okay? And that's on both the left and the right, okay? There are sort of divides and there are factions that sort of develop at the top of society, but there are certain things that they have, or certain interests that they have in common, right? So just sort of keep that in mind. It's one of my pet peeves that people keep saying it's a Marxist agenda. The people at the top of our society are not Marxists, none of them. And in fact, wherever Marxism has sprung up around the world, the government and corporate power have united to snuff it out. So we saw this in Central America with the United Fruit Company, which later became Dole Fruits. And yes, that's from Bob Dole, the United States, that when their interests were threatened, the CIA worked together to stage military coups and, to go out and actually kill Marxists. So wherever Marxists become a real legitimate threat, corporate power doesn't just sit back and take it, all right? They activate and they unify with the establishment to snuff out Marxists. So let's be clear about that. And again, sort of looking at the top of our media establishment, you need to understand a concept known as interlocking directorships. Okay, because a lot of the directors of these and executives of these companies go back and forth, not just between themselves or sit on the same on the boards of different companies at the same time, but many of the people that you see in government are either sort of top lawyers or they're top people from the business world or both. So you look at somebody like Dick Cheney, for instance, running Halliburton one day, next day he's vice president of the United States, right? But this applies to the media too. There's like this revolving door that goes on. So there is that sort of overt control over the media, but for the most part, editors and owners getting involved in censoring the news that makes it out to the public is just far too much work, right? So that leads us to Chomsky's second method of media control, which was filtering, conditioning, and selecting. So it is far easier for management and owners to control the news by just making sure that they select carefully who their reporters are. Okay, so you don't need to control somebody if they already think the same way as you. So you screen people during the hiring process to make sure you're getting people who already think correctly. There was a famous interview of Noam Chomsky that appeared on the BBC in the UK, and the reporter was kind of offended by the notion that he was reporting on things just to sort of align himself with the establishment, and he was being controlled by the establishment. And Noam said, "No, wait a second. I'm not saying that you're controlled and that your thoughts are not free. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you wouldn't be where you are if you didn't already think correctly." Okay, and so that is one of the methodologies of control. But he also talks about there being sort of a filtering system in place in our society that filters out people before they get to positions of power. So you're conditioned in schools and stuff, and then when you get into the post-secondary institutions, there's even more filtering that goes through. So you look at sort of applications for graduate school and stuff, and you'll see there are commentaries and stuff frequently that talk about, oh, well, this particular candidate doesn't get along well with his peers and stuff like that. Now, that's actually, I think, whether or not you get along with your peers is irrelevant, but it shows that you're not a team player, right? And so that's a red flag for the establishment. So I've been called by a prominent member of the Conservative Party, who at one point seemed to be interested in what I was saying. He referred to me as a loose cannon, right? So that's doesn't get along with his peers. That's me. I'm a loose cannon, but I am an unapologetic loose cannon because I follow the truth and the facts where they lead me. If that offends somebody, well, too bad. But so that is the second method of control. And for the most part, Chomsky would argue that those two methods of control are almost absolute when it comes to controlling the mainstream media. And he makes a powerful case for this in his book that he did with Edward Herman. But now we're getting into a key point of control that I add to this, that Noam Chomsky did not include in his book, even though I am positive that he knew about it. Okay, but perhaps he didn't want to address it because it was just too sensitive of a subject. Now, this is a big subject, and it's going to require an awful lot of evidence for me to prove it. And this is not the theory, but the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence agencies have infiltrated the media a long time ago, and their purpose in the media is to spin and control information and to manipulate your mind. Okay, and as I sort of said at the start there, it is far more dangerous and pervasive than most people could even imagine. And this is going to be the subject that I bring up next week. But I want to give you just some teasers, because it's not just the intelligence infiltration of the media that I'm going to be talking about and documenting, right? Critically documenting, but it's also what we see going on with social media. Okay, so what I have seen and why social media has become a central focus in society today and a central focus of the establishment. To give you just sort of a taste for what's going and a taste for the attitude of the public, or not the public, but the establishment about social media, I want to play just a clip here from Pierre Trudeau, who recently talked at a press gathering about the media. And I want you to pay attention to his attitude about social media, and we'll maybe deal with some other points too. So hang on here. I can find it. There it is. Okay, here we go.
A free press is the foundation of democracy. Full stop. I know you believe that, and I know that's why you do the work you do. You have a pretty powerful responsibility. And as much as you guys can give me a hard time, I wouldn't have it any other way. So please, keep asking the tough questions and keep us engaged in the essential debates that are shaping our society. I must say, though, I am disappointed to see that Andrew Coyne couldn't make it tonight. Apparently, he was worried that if he came, he wouldn't meet his daily quota of 21 hours on the social media vomitorium. Other members
on the social media vomitorium. Okay, so what you'll see at the top of our society is a bitter contempt for social media.
of the press have chosen to distance themselves from the black hole that is Twitter so they could focus on the lucrative side hustle of book writing instead. Now, you sometimes hear about liberal bias in the media these days, how they're constantly letting our government off the hook for no good reason. Frankly, I think that's insulting. It's clear that they let us off the hook for a very good reason, because we paid them $600 million. You don't get stellar headlines like these without greasing the wheels a bit.
This is actually interesting because there was, and this is another thing for people to pay attention to. You always got to go to the original source when you're making arguments to confirm what's being presented to you is as accurate as possible, because there were people in the right wing and alternative media who left these screenshots out. right? And just sort of did a selective edit that made it look like Trudeau was laughing it up because he paid off the media. Now, obviously, he was doing it sarcastically, and he's trying here to downplay the fact that the government gave $600 million to the mainstream media in Canada, or the implications of such a massive bailout. I would argue that this $600 million bailout is a quid pro quo, okay? It's for services rendered, and it's not to Trudeau, okay? It's to the establishment.
Yeah. As we stand here tonight.
And that's an important thing to note there, to the establishment. So in order for people to trust and believe that the establishment actually works, there has to be something that resembles a working press or media. People frequently have this concept of propaganda and media control being a feature exclusively of totalitarian states like in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany. But as Chomsky sort of illustrated, control of information is actually far more important in what we call democratic societies, okay? Because over in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, they could use the club and the gun to get people in mind. Over here, they have to have a facade of not being that which everybody has come to hate, which is the totalitarian state. So the club that they use is what we will call a silent weapon, and it's the media. But if the media is always sort of spouting the government line, people are going to slowly start to distrust the media. So there has to be some sort of debates going on there and some sort of criticisms going on there. As Noam Chomsky said, you've got the right-wing media and the left-wing media. What the left-wing media tends to do is it tends to set the limits, okay? This is how far you can go in terms of government criticism, but no further. So they set the range of debate as well. And this is a critical thing to be functioning in what I would call an invisible or stealth totalitarian state. It is to create this illusion of a functioning system.
And celebrate the freedom of our press. We can't forget the journalists around the world who are jailed, persecuted, or killed simply for doing their job. But we also need to be vigilant here at home. We live in a time when people are losing trust in their institutions, and the news is no exception.
They're losing trust in their institutions, okay? And this is going to loop us around to social media.
We're witnessing dangerous trends, not just online, but in our communities as well. It is the job of every single person in this room, members of the press, politicians, staff, to uphold and renew that trust.
I would say uphold and enforce that trust. And that is what you're seeing now. So in just a setup for next week, let me just say that and we'll get into the intelligence thing again next week, but the control over the mainstream media was so absolute, in my opinion, for such a long time. And they had sort of, I think, tinkered it into a fine engine of mass mind control. And they had that in place until the internet came along and until social media came along. Social media, I have argued and argue in my talks now, is the most powerful democratizing tool to ever be entered into the human information landscape. Okay, what it does is it takes absolute control against or away from the mainstream media and the establishment, and it moves it into this democratic place, which is what social media and digital media has become. And I would argue that I am sort of the perfect example of why the establishment is terrified of social media. Okay, so I was a nobody, really, with absolutely no power, no voice. How was it that I, as a nobody, was able to thrust myself into the middle of a very crucial and key argument going on in our society today. How did I do that? Well, I did that first and foremost by an enormous amount of research and dedication, but also I would not have been able to do it without the existence of social media. Okay, so when I go to post media, or I go to black press and try to put ads, they don't let me. Okay, and when the media writes about what I'm doing, in almost every instance, the stories that you see written about me are deceptive and derogatory, or they're what I call neutral negative. By neutral negative, what I mean is they will report on the details of the story, and then they will quote people who say terrible things about me. But then in almost every instance, they refuse to come to me and get a quote or a response from me. That's what I call neutral negative. So the reporter themselves doesn't actually say anything negative. They try to appear neutral. They let the people that they're quoting say all the negative things about me, which plants the idea in their mind. But the thing is that that's what I was dealing with. Okay, so the mainstream media was shutting me down and defaming me. Okay, without social media, I would have just slammed into that wall and would have never been able to get anywhere. It was social media and my working of social media and advertising as I am now and putting my message out there. That was what allowed me to gain enough attention and momentum to thrust myself into the middle of this debate. Okay, and nobody who has not been vetted by the system. And that is why the establishment is terrified of social media. And that is why we are seeing a push to crack down on social media. And it's not one of these things that they're prepared to negotiate on. Okay, they want absolute control over this so they don't have repeats of people like me. There is a range of acceptable debate, and they do not want anybody to be able to cause them problems. And so they are addressing the social media thing. I'm going to show you how they're addressing that, and I'm going to link it into this whole question of the CIA and the media. But let me just give you another teaser here for what's coming next week. I'm going to play a short video clip for you. And just before I play this video, I should say that what I'm going to play here comes from the 1970s, and it had to do with something called the Church Committee, which was basically assembled to review and analyze the actions and projects undertaken by the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. And a massive amount of data was reviewed, and an awful lot of stuff came out. The Church Committee has largely been forgotten. I would say it's been deliberately forgotten. But let's just take a listen to this.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Okay, in executive session. And of course, what he means by that is in private and away from the prying eyes of the public. Okay, and this gets me into something that everybody needs to understand, because people say to me that if intelligence operations in the media were happening, why don't we know about it? Right? Why isn't our government more active in telling us about it? Why isn't members of the media telling us about it? Well, that would be because they are, in my opinion, in cahoots. And let's just take a look at something else here. And by the way, as you can see here, there we go. How about to that size? There we go. So the Church Committee was essentially investigated by, I don't know why it keeps showing me that other screen. I need some experts with me here. That's what I need. In any case, it was investigated by, make sure I click on the right buttons here, by Carl Bernstein. So sort of a legendary Washington Post reporter. He took a look at the Church Committee, and he published something in 1977 and was essentially forced to publish it as part of the Rolling Stone magazine. And not in mainstream papers. And this is the story of the CIA and the media. I would argue that Bernstein's article, which people should probably read, and it's on Bernstein's website. Let me just show you that. There we go. So people should maybe take some time to read this article on Bernstein's website. But keep in mind that my thesis about this particular essay is that it's essentially a whitewash. Okay. Now, next week, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be providing all kinds of proof and evidence, video footage, actual documents that show the level of infiltration in the media and the fact that we have intelligence agents working in the media to spin public opinion. Okay, and this is where we get back to my sort of opening hypothetical Schrodinger's cat type thought experiment that, perhaps what we're seeing in the media is a carefully constructed and controlled fake reality. Okay, when they talk about the danger of fake news in the media, let's see if I can. I'm going to switch screens again here. When they talk about the danger of fake news on social media coming from people like me, apparently I'm a purveyor of fake news. I got one warning from Facebook already that it was fake news. What they're really afraid of is they're afraid that people like me are going to show that they are the purveyors of fake news, and that what we have going on in our mainstream media is mass mind control. Okay, and I know that's a powerful statement that most people probably won't be able to accept, but I'm going to give you powerful evidence of it. And I think that sort of video that I played there from the Church Committee gives you a hint that there are secret things going on in our establishment today. And that was way back in the 70s. And my thesis now is that it is much, much worse today. And so that is basically it for this week. Next week, I'm going to look at the proof for intelligence and infiltration of the media, not only in the United States, but globally. And I'm going to look at the problem of social media and how this all links into the creation and the move towards a totalitarian state, what I would call not only creeping totalitarianism, but almost a kind of invisible totalitarianism. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Okay, so let's just see. This is what Deborah says. How do I approach the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives? Okay, so one of the things that I've observed in my time in this struggle is that there are certain key institutions that sustain power today in our society. Okay, that's the government, that's the media, that's the courts, and that's sort of NGOs, which would include organizations like the Centre for Policy Alternatives, Canadian this is the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, these types of organizations. What you will see in my case, now if you go back and you watch my 6 months of madness video that I did and understand the kind of level of opposition and the attempts to silence me and shut me down that has gone on. We even have evidence of a police stand down in Oak Bay and interference from the highest levels of government. When you understand the level of censorship that has been targeted against me, you would think that those institutions in our society who portray themselves as defending freedom of speech and civil liberties would have been rushing to my defense, particularly when I was all over the news during the whole UBC thing, right? But that's not what we see, okay? So most of these institutions want nothing to do with me, okay? The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, for instance, has essentially implied that I'm just too troublesome to work with. Now, my response to that would be, okay, so you're a defender of freedom of speech. Exactly what type of people do you think you're going to be dealing with if you're a true defender of free speech, right? You think you're not going to be dealing with people who, won't shut up when they're told to shut up? Maybe some strong-willed people? I would think that that would go with the territory. And if you're a true defender of free speech, you're going to realize this about the people you're going to be dealing with, and you're going to work with them. So will I surrender my freedom, right, and my fate absolutely 100% to a bunch of lawyers who I don't know? No, of course not. I want to retain some sort of control over what's happening. Now, these establishments or these organizations say, well, that makes you too troublesome. Right. So back to this loose cannon thing, the Conservative Party member who said that I was a loose cannon and couldn't be controlled. Right. You have to be controlled and play within certain narratives. So the JCCF and some of these other non-governmental institutions, I would argue, are part of the establishment. Right. I mean, just look at what happened at Oak Bay with the police stand down and everything. Right. And the involvement of the mayor there. Look what happened at the Hub in Victoria, where we had the Minister of Education and the Mayor of Victoria trying to use their influence to get my talk shut down in Victoria, okay? These are massive threats to free speech in Canada, but where were our civil liberties organizations? Have any of them said that they will represent me in these cases? The answer is no. Okay, they would rather, like they say, now this is where it gets problematic, okay, because they say that I'm just too strong-willed or something and I won't just let them do whatever they want. So that's why they presumably don't want to have anything to do with me, right? But, I'm too troublesome. But yet they will represent somebody like Bill Walcott, who's like this wild, right-wing, extreme Christian boogeyman figure, right? They will represent Walcott, but they say that I'm just too much trouble. Okay, I try to keep my arguments all documented, right, and present them in a reasonable way. Am I strong-willed? Yes. Okay, but I believe that when you're dealing with me, my information is much cleaner, much better researched, and much more powerful than anything Bill Walcott has ever put out. And yet they'll represent his freedom of speech, but completely abandon me. Okay, and this goes across the board. Like there's the BC Civil Liberties organization here in BC, which I have said I regard as completely useless. All they seem to do is go out and dine at expensive gatherings and issue statements every once in a while. So we have sort of a systemic failure that's going on. I believe what we need in free societies is actually a governmental defender of freedom of speech, set up to strongly make sure that free speech is protected, which it's not getting right now. And that's because the establishment doesn't want it protected. And they particularly don't want it protected against people like me, who keep revealing anti-establishment things and providing all kinds of proof for it. So we have a problem. And again, sort of answering your thing about the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, I've not tried to contact them. What I have found for the most part is right-wing organizations don't want anything to do with me because they believe in the establishment for the most part. Okay, it's just that it's either this whole left-right thing. Okay, so you either have to believe that the left is going to save you, or you have to believe that the right is going to save you. Somebody like me who says that the whole system is rotten is a problem for these people. Okay, because they want you to have faith in the system. My argument is that the system has failed, and the system right now is under the control of megalomaniacs who don't want the people to have any say in what's going on today. Yeah, so I believe we live in sort of I don't believe we're in a free society right now. Okay, we're in a controlled society. So the people who lead our country, for the most part, are not voted in. They're selected, and then we're given a choice between Stooge A or Stooge B. And the media is constantly playing with our minds and creating fake heroes all the time, like this Jody Wilson-Raybould, right? I was quite surprised everybody saw her as this great champion of integrity. Well, I remember Jody as being the government minister who brought us Bill C-16 and used this child as a propaganda tool to help ram Bill C-16 through the legislature and the parliament. Okay, so she's part of the establishment, part of the problem. Yet we've got so many people who have been convinced to think that she's some sort of hero. I don't know if people know anything about Wilson-Raybould's father, Bill Wilson, but he's one of the most vicious racists I've ever seen in my life. Okay, he basically has said that the white people should have all been exterminated. Okay, so she's got that in her background too, and yet she's portrayed as some sort of great, heroine of society today. But that's the game that the media keeps doing. They keep offering these heroes for us, like Jordan Peterson, right? So yeah, we've got a problem. Yeah, I would agree with you there. There's nobody in government right now that I trust at all. We can talk about, actually, we should talk about, see if I've got it here. I'm going to try to find it. Give me a second, because this is going to come up next week too. I can find it here. No, I don't have it handy. In any case, Maxime Bernier was portrayed as this great champion of free speech in the last election. Now, I'll say that most of the supporters of the People's Party of Canada I got along with, and met a lot of good people in the PPC. Some maybe not so good, but a lot of really good people, and that were following that. And they were like these sort of hardcore supporters of Maxime Bernier. And I said, well, Maxime Bernier comes from the establishment. He's an establishment guy. He used to work for, what was it, the Montreal Economic, I forget what it is, but something under the aegis of the Power Corporation. And he was the Desmarais, the wealthiest family in Canada at the time, the Desmarais family's go-to guy in Ottawa. And I said, well, this guy is a people's guy all of a sudden, this guy who represented the wealthiest in Canada, really? And what we saw is that between the digital charter that Trudeau put out and this study that came out in November called Democracy Under Threat, which is a joke of a title, if ever there was one, because they were suggesting that social media was this threat to democracy, when in fact it was the people writing the study that were the threat to democracy. And who was one of the key people on the Democracy Under Threat committee that recommended all of this censorship online, censorship of social media, and hate speech and fake news and extremism. Who sort of was on that committee that recommended cracking down on all this stuff on social media? Well, it was Maxime Bernier, right? So censorship of social media is something that the entire establishment supports right now. Left, right, center, extreme left, extreme left, all of them across the board support it. And that's because they're all in cahoots together, okay? And the last thing they want is for people like me to be able to rally and organize and spread information that they can't control. And so there is a push to get this cracked down, and I believe they have their intelligence assets on it, and that is all going to be proved next week. Can't create order if everyone gets to make their own good and evil. Well, I would say it's a little more complicated than that. Okay, so why should Raybould be condemned for her father's actions? I'm not condemning Raybould for her father's actions per se, but what you need to understand is that her mind was shaped by her father, okay? So to think that that doesn't play some sort of role in her view of the world is probably incorrect. Now, I understand people will rebel against their parents all the time, and certainly she hasn't used any of the sort of hardcore racist vitriol that her father has. My bigger concern with Wilson Raybould is her involvement in C-16 and this massive propaganda effort of Bill C-16. And I remember she made some outrageous comments in the press that were clear propaganda designed to push through C-16 and ultimately be used to justify the transitioning of children and the trampling of women's rights. And people can't forget that about Wilson Raybould. Do you even trust yourself, Jen Smith? You seem to think you're a man, but dressed like a woman and use a woman's name. How does that make any sense? Okay, so this is one of the things that I've said about transgender identity. Okay, identity, whether you're talking about transgender or any kind of identity, is like, there's the old saying that you can't step into the same stream twice because it's constantly flowing and changing. And identity and consciousness I regard as the same thing. So people are constantly growing and changing. So who I am and how I express in the world is the product of a lifetime of experiences. Okay, so trying to make sense out of me in something that I can respond to you with in a paragraph is not going to work, because my identity has a long history. Okay, so how does this make sense? I use what is called a woman's name, Jen. Actually, I use Jen, and I chose Jen because Jen is actually short for Jenner. Did you know that there is a first name called Jenner and that this is a guy's name? Okay, but I deliberately chose Jen because I didn't want Jennifer, because I thought that was just too female. But in my interactions with males, and others over the years, many of them found it difficult referring to me using my male name. So I came up with what I thought was a neutral name called Jen, which is short for Jenner. And there's a whole sort of psychological dynamic that goes on there. As far as how I dress, again, this is something that has sort of evolved over the course of my lifetime. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. How I dress doesn't matter. Okay, and that was one of my big arguments. Okay, dress and expression and how you manifest and interact with people in the world, that's all mind stuff, and it doesn't matter. Okay, what you can't do is, wear things and make yourself up in ways that are traditionally and stereotypically associated with women, and then say, aha, here I am, now I am a woman. Okay, I am the antithesis to that. I'm saying, no, I can do all of that stuff. I can have the long hair, the long earrings, the eyeshadow, the skirt, and all this stuff, but none of that changes my sex. Okay, not only does it not change my sex, it doesn't matter. Okay, it's what you're intending to do. I think that is where you start getting into, whether something is right or wrong. And I would say the object that we should be deriding would be the intent to deceive people. Okay, so I don't deceive people. I don't try to deceive people. I don't try to convince anybody that I actually am a woman. I don't demand entry to women's change rooms and stuff like that. Okay, and I also say that I bitterly resent them going to young, vulnerable children and telling them that they can change sex. Okay, I believe that is criminally negligent. Okay, so I have a different view of gender identity, and I have a different view of gender expression in the world. How I dress is irrelevant. What name I choose to use is irrelevant, right? What is relevant is what I am biologically and physically. And I would argue that our language, so language in terms of words that we all use and share in common. Okay, names, anybody can be named whatever they want. Okay, Chris is a guy's name and it's a girl's name, right? So names are individual and it doesn't really matter. But things like pronouns, so like he, she, him, her, man, woman, these things matter because they're shared. Okay, so that's one of the reasons I don't surrender to language. But how I dress and stuff and what name I use just doesn't matter. And it's not going to be easy for you to figure it out. Okay, so this is an interesting comment from Deborah Diddick, that Canada is the 51st state. If people think that the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world, Pierre Trudeau once described being next to the United States as like being a mouse living next to an elephant, right? You gotta be careful when the elephant rolls over. If people think that this enormous superpower that lives next to Canada would just allow us to conduct ourselves in a free and democratic way, I think you're delusional. Okay, most people don't understand that. Again, this is back to this whole Marxist thing, and whether we have a Marxist conspiracy. The establishment doesn't put up with Marxist conspiracies. They will allow us a certain amount of play, but they don't care whether you're a dictatorship or a democracy. Marxism is one of their key enemies, and we saw this in 1972 in Australia. And I'll get into this next week when the Central Intelligence Agency took part in a coup of a democratically elected government in Australia. Okay, and if you think that they wouldn't get involved in Canadian politics, you're dreaming. Bruce Jenner, but that's a surname. But there's also Jenner, the first name. Look it up. My own personal health. My own personal health. I don't use hormones. I don't use puberty blockers. I don't use hormone blockers. I don't use any of that type of stuff. I'm all natural. And this is, so being honest, it's really critically important right now in history that people who are trying to inject themselves into the political debates of what's going on in our society today be as honest as they can. And particularly somebody in my position. Okay, I have a lot of sort of vulnerabilities and stuff that I've gone through in my life that I would rather not be sharing with the entire world. But at this point, it's really critically important. Right? And I've had to do an awful lot of introspection in trying to understand myself and how I've gotten to this place in my life in order to share that with the world and use it to try to bring society back to sanity and move society away from this sort of corporate elite, silent, creeping totalitarianism that we see coming into place. The only way that I'm going to be able to break through that is by, being sort of ruthlessly dedicated to being as open and honest as I can. There's things that I don't like to talk about, but I talk about anyway because they're important. What I would say there, Deborah, is a lot of the veterans, U.S. veterans, weren't helped by their government either. Okay, so it does matter. What if kids see you? Now they will be confused. Okay. Okay, so this is an interesting point. Okay, so sometimes when I go into a men's room dressed like this, young kid will come in, young boy will come in. Sometimes they'll stop when they come in because they see me and they think that first they're in the wrong washroom and stuff like that. And these little instances or moments in time are problematic for me philosophically. Okay. I understand what you're saying, and you're right. It is confusing for kids. But all of these kids, ultimately, they'll come in and they'll see me dressed like this, but it doesn't take them long to figure out that I am male. Okay. So they come to that realization. It's difficult, and I'm in a difficult position. Because I have done this, I understand that it's confusing for children, but I have decided that I need to keep on keeping on because I'm involved in a political war. Okay, I don't know the full solution to everything. I know there are certain things that we're doing that we shouldn't be doing, but what is the full solution in the long run? Is there any way to escape what's going on in society? Because I've got a lot of big theories about what's going on with transgender identity. One of my theories is that transgender identity is a manifestation of an oversexed society. It is a society that has for countless decades now been bombarding human consciousness with hypersexualized images of females. And this has had an effect on the minds of society. Okay, so there are many who see this and want to be that, both male and female. Okay, so on the male side of the equation, it's there's a whole bunch of different reasons on the male side of the equation of wanting to be that. On the female side of the equation, and I've discussed this with Stephanie Davies Araya many times, there's so many girls who feel that they can't live up to these hypersexual images. And so they're opting out. They think it'd be easier to be a guy or whatever. And it is easier to be a guy. This is a lot of work, right? And that's why later in life you see so many women who just sort of stop trying to do all the makeup and everything because it's just too much work. But there's all kinds of reasons, I think, why. And I do believe that the hyper-sexualization of society has played a role. So one of these things that I didn't want to talk about initially, but I've been forced to talk about, is the whole issue of the fact that I worked for a time doing transgender sex work. I learned some important things in that time because the clientele that I dealt with were almost exclusively males. Okay, and it's strange because Morgane Auger put out this tweet about me a while back, trying to insult me, saying I was nothing more than a cross-dresser, as if there was some difference between Morgane and myself, some sort of substantive difference. And what he said in that tweet was that I was so stuck in the 1950s that I didn't understand the difference between being transgender and dressing up to please a gay man. Well, that was sort of a clue to me when he put that statement out that Morgane Auger knows nothing about dating as a transgender person, because the vast majority of the men that have hit on me in my life, and a vast majority of men who came to me to seek services when I was doing sex work, described themselves as either bisexual or more commonly as heterosexual. Okay, like I could count maybe on one hand the number of gay men that have hit on me in my life. Okay, very small number. The number of bisexual and heterosexual men that have hit on me is legion at this point. So what's going on there? Okay, and why, furthermore, do I get men or have I had men in my lifetime hitting on me while describing themselves as heterosexual? Okay, so two classes of these men that I've seen over the years. One are ones who came to me because they wanted to do what I was doing, and they were looking essentially for a mentor, right? And wanted sort of like a safe space for them to play with this and some coaching and this type of thing. They, for the most part, when dealing, and I've had the opportunity, like I'm a university educated and stuff, and I like to think of myself as a sort of a savvy analyst. So they wouldn't know this, and probably they wouldn't have come seen me if they knew I was doing this, but I very carefully analyzed the men that I was dealing with. And I would say for the most part, the men that wanted to be transgender themselves or dabble in being transgender were what Ray Blanchard would call autogynephiles. I don't like that term because it's oversimplistic. In fact, I would get rid of it completely, because right now it's used as a slur and it's used as an insult. But if you sort of take it in its rawest form, which is not possible anymore, but let's try to do it for a second here. These were men who were exposed to these hypersexual images of females in the mainstream media and in pornography, and they wanted to be that, right? So that was like an inner desire, but as a result of being bombarded throughout their lifetime with these hypersexual images. I mean, we're bombarded with hypersexuality in ways totally out of balance with the rest of nature. Okay, no other creature in nature focuses on sexuality like human culture does, and I believe this is having a damaging impact on the collective psychology of humankind, and that, like the evidence I think is pretty strong, because, for instance, the appearance of hypersexuality and pornography and stuff has really only been sort of maximized during the course of my life. Okay, so it was like in the 60s and 70s that we saw the appearance, or at least the ubiquitous appearance of hardcore pornography and stuff. And so I've been able to sort of trace that over the course of my life. And this sort of bombardment of hypersexuality has, I think, traumatized the human mind. And what tends to get missed, I think, by the feminist community is that it's had just as devastating effect on the male mind as on the female mind, but in a different way. Okay, so we've got all these men who want to be that, right? And then you've got this other group of men who describe themselves as heterosexual. So what's going on there? What's going on there? Because they know that I am actually male. That's why actually they've come to see me. And that's why I've always sort of argued against genital reassignment surgery, because most of the men if not all of the men who hit on me wanted to know that my parts were still intact and still functional. But they had this need to see me as a woman. I think what's happened is that particularly pornography has had such a powerful impact on the male mind that when you're seeing all of these phalluses and stuff all the time in pornography, many men start getting attracted to that. Okay, but if they're heterosexual, they don't want to see themselves as being gay or even bisexual in many cases. So they start looking for alternatives, and that's me. Okay, or people like me. Okay, so we provide an illusion that allows these men to explore their phallic fetishes and tell themselves that they're not really being gay, right? So it's kind of an illusion. And I know that there's all kinds of sort of philosophical, moral questions, particularly coming out of the Christian community in regard to the role that I've played in that. And I understand that, and I get that. I'm just trying to explain the way that I think it works. Okay, so we've got these men who are sort of obsessed with the phallus and have had this sort of, had their minds bombarded with it, and they want to experiment with that. So they need somebody like me that provides them with enough of an illusion that they don't get their sense of their manhood and sexuality questioned in the process, or at least not in an overly aggressive way, right? Because most of these men who would describe themselves as heterosexual would never hook up with a guy who's just a guy, right? They would never do it. They couldn't bring themselves to do it. So now that's a confusing thing. So this back to this question of the kids, that I'm confusing kids by doing what I'm doing. Yeah, but again, I'm going to say that I think one of the long-term solutions to what's going on is desexualizing humanity to a certain extent, or at least roll back this hypersexual trend that we've gotten into, where we're bombarding the mind with these sexual images. Or you're going to see, like, I'm just like one person, but you're going to continue to see people like me as long as we remain obsessed on this, as long as society keeps holding up these super pretty, sexy females as this ultimate, right? It's a difficult thing to deal with, but I sort of get your point. I get your point. Yes, big money owns government. Big money owns the political parties, left, right, center, period. Okay, not just big money, but elite power. Oh, I'm talking about my mental and spiritual health. We will never get rid of psychological and emotional problems in humanity. Again, I can't be understood at any given sort of point in time in my life. I am the totality of my life, and understanding me, the only way to understand me is to understand my life and my evolution. As far as what's good for my spiritual well-being, I actually don't think dressing like this is harmful to my spiritual health. Being assaulted regularly and demeaned regularly by the LGBTQ establishment and what I've been subjected to, that is very sort of harmful to my mental health. But it's something that needs to be done anyway. You can't make society more sane while still believing in subjectivism. Well, that statement is an interesting statement. Okay, so this gets us into the difference between sex and gender. Okay, so sex is not subjective. Okay, this is one of my constant arguments. Biological sex is determined when you're born. It's determined in your chromosome. You're either male or you're female, period. You can't think your way out of that state. Okay, gender is separate. Gender is a mind thing. Okay, and that's why gender rules and expectations vary from not only from culture to culture, but even within a culture over the expanse of time. Okay, and men didn't always wear pants. So what is masculine and what is feminine changes over time. Okay, so Prince back in the 80s was a man who wore women's fashions, women's boots and lace and stuff like that, but he was a man, right? And how he dressed didn't change that fact. I would say the same thing for me too. Okay, is it more extreme that I wear a skirt or eyeshadow? Sure, but not much, unless you convince yourself that it is. But that's subjective, okay? So what's masculine and what's feminine is subjective. There's no question about that. It changes over time, right? Little girls aren't born with high heel shoes, right? They have to be introduced to that and instructed by the world around them that this is a feminine thing. So that is subjective. Yeah, of course I'm part of a community. Okay, this is one of the interesting things in this debate is I'm continually attacked by the other side of this debate who try to say that I'm, a right-wing extremist. I'm not a right-wing extremist. I'm an old Noam Chomsky disciple. Okay, I'm on the left, right? So I understand the fact that we're part of a community and we can't sort of understand our actions outside, like in a completely individualistic way, right? We have to be aware of how our actions and how our decisions affect other people. And I'm aware of that. But people need to understand that this is a very difficult time in our history and that I am in a very difficult position, an extraordinarily difficult position. I am doing and proceeding in this debate in the best way I know how. And that's all I can do. Thank you. Love-hate's view of women. This is interesting because I deal with so many feminists, right? Feminism is a sort of a broad, sort of expansive term that encompasses women of all sort of different viewpoints. People sort of say some people on the right sort of use feminist almost like a slur in some cases, but it's also a grotesque generalization because in my experiences with feminists, there's a broad range of views. There's people who just sort of believe that we have sort of a patriarchy set up that favors male privilege and power. And it's pretty easy to demonstrate looking at the corporate world. And I'm not going to get into this whole debate, but that's a sort of kind of an intelligible argument that you're either going to agree with or disagree with. But also in the feminist community, you can go way over to the extremes where there are these women who just hate men, they despise men. And no matter what I do, for instance, there are feminists who just loathe me, right? I can argue day and night to protect their rights. They'll still regard me as the scum of the earth, right? So the feminist community is a really sort of broad community. And in terms of the sort of this love-hate relationship with women, got to be careful there, okay? So I don't hate women. I've never hated women. You could say at some point that I envied women, at least the role of women and the stereotypical woman. But there are men, that they don't despise women so much as they despise strong women. Okay, because a lot of men are used to, especially powerful men, are used to calling the shots, and they don't like some strong woman coming along trying to, stick their heads into their turf, right? And some men arguably believe that women have a place and they should know their place, right? I don't agree with that. I've never agreed with that, right? I've never seen women as lesser than me. I've never hated women for being women. I kind of get what you're saying, but I think it's maybe a little too general. Okay, so North Iowa says, find God. Well, actually, that's why I wear a cross, not because I'm a Christian, but because I have a powerful, and I don't like to use the word belief, but I have a powerful belief in God. I would say I know God exists, but I don't want to start unpacking that whole thing. That's why one of the primary reasons I do what I do, okay? Because I'm ultimately, at my core, I'm a cynic, right? Or actually, Noam Chomsky said, I'm not a cynic, I'm a realist. So one can debate whether I'm a cynic or whether I'm a realist. But at my core, I'm a cynic. And I've said many times, and I said at the start of this broadcast today, that I don't always have a whole lot of hope for succeeding at what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to bring about. It is my faith in a higher power that keeps me going, because ultimately I believe that this is between myself and my God, and that I am expected, whether or not it looks possible or not, to do the right thing, okay, and to speak up for the truth. That is my duty. My duty is not to win, okay? My duty is to do the right thing. And I do not want to nitpick the details, like what I dress, how I dress and stuff like that. That is just such a minor detail in terms of what we're talking about right now. Now, in terms of how we let children manifest in the world, well, that's a different issue, okay? So children always have to be treated different than adults, okay? This is a hugely complicated issue. You'll be good to know that I've never been a fan of sodomy there, North Owl. That's in a presumption, okay? So people presume that if you dress as a woman or if you're gay, that automatically means you engage in sodomy. You're not right. You're incorrect. I'm not going to break that down for you. I'm just going through the comments here. I'm really done my presentation. The women role models are men. Well, you see, in some cases that may be correct. So we roll back the clock. We've got all these transgender activists now that will point to historic examples of women dressing up as men, like a woman who dresses up as a man to be a doctor, and say, aha, transgenderism. She didn't believe she was a man. She took on the role of a man because that was the only way she could be a doctor, right? So there's something to that. But in many of the cases that I look at, it's a different story. So we look at the case of this young girl who was the center of this case at the Children's Hospital here in BC, where she's gone on to testosterone therapy despite her father's wishes. That's now in court, going through all of this. We look at this case, we've got a young girl who began making romantic advances to older men and was rejected and spurned. And what I think sort of happened in that case was that she felt that she wasn't pretty enough. She wasn't womanly enough or sexy enough to attract these men. And it was that point she started thinking, well, maybe I'm a boy. Maybe it'd be easier to be a boy. And that's when she started sort of identifying as a boy, because she couldn't, sort of meet the expectations. But again, a transgender identity, whether we're talking masculine to feminine or feminine to masculine, it's complicated and it varies from case to case. But I believe the hypersexual image, and you can see this, so you look at the rise of hardcore pornography in Western culture over the decades, right? And right along with the rise, and I know correlation doesn't prove causation, but it's instructive. Okay, right along with that rise is a rise in transgender identity. Okay, so the more sexualized our culture has gotten, the more transgender identity has come to play a role. Again, there's going to be all kinds of things at work there, though. Porn is completely out of control right now. Some of the stuff that's out there on the web. I remember Megan Murphy. I don't really go along with Megan Murphy these days, but I remember she did some presentation on some of the pornography that's out there that is really abuse and violence. And porn has gone over the edge. It used to be the kind of vicious aggression and abuse that is so common in pornography today was illegal. And I would say it should still be illegal because of what it can lead to, and because of the, especially what it's doing to young people again, and giving this concept that abusing women sexually is acceptable. And I think that's a very ugly, dangerous trend that we've gotten into. If you roll back to some of the more benign forms of pornography, kept within the bedroom, kept to adults, relatively harmless, right? But some of this abusive stuff is dangerous. Yeah, it used to be just, like I say, the rise of pornography has happened in my lifetime, so I've been able to sort of see that. And the appearance of pornography when I was a kid, I believe, played a role in shaping my identity. So I remember looking at like Playboy magazines and stuff and going, wow. And then I've got this super pretty foster sister who was so popular and stuff. And that's when I sort of began trying to emulate that, right? So there's stuff to that. Cosplay, yeah. Well, this is just like what we're seeing now is that a desensitization, okay? So and this is one of the reasons I'm so opposed to this harmless pedophile narrative that's being pushed out there by so many people, that they want to normalize the idea that you could be a pedophile and not be harmful to society, and we need to develop compassion and respect for pedophiles. I think that is a dangerous trend, okay? Because one of the toughest things that a pedophile has to do is justify it within themselves. What these people like James Cantor and Orrin Amate and all these people are trying to do is they're basically taking that out of the equation for them and saying, oh, it's not your fault. You were born that way. You were born a pedophile. Now you just need to control your behaviors. But they're taking away one of the big sort of things that has protected children over the years, and that's this powerful social stigma against it, right? So I've said, just, don't remove those stigmas. Leave them in place. Don't go, giving excuses for pedophilic impulses. And part of the reason for that, and this gets into this cosplay thing, is when you take away some of these moral limitations, right? So, or the taboos, when you take away a taboo, that is, okay, people always seem like they want to break taboos, right? So the more liberal your society becomes, the more extreme the taboo breaking becomes, right? So there is an argument to roll a lot of that back and keep a lot of these taboos in place, especially against pedophilia, in order to keep the taboo breaking limited as well. Because if more and more and more becomes acceptable, people are always looking for something more imaginative and more extreme. And the cosplay thing is, a relatively harmless, projection of the imagination, because people are so bored with what is out there. I don't buy the Marxist thing. Okay, you look at the history of the CIA, where real Marxists have emerged in the world as a threat to corporate power. They have been attacked by the Central Intelligence Agency and killed. And I can document that over and over and over again. The corporate power in this world are not Marxist. Period. None of the government, none of the corporations, they will not let a true Marxist in their midst, period. And if they're found in their midst, they're gone. Yeah, well, men, like yeah, get abused by men. Male culture has, up to this point, been a very aggressive and abrasive culture. Part of that is nature. So there's nature and nurture at work there. So men have testosterone. We know testosterone and high levels of testosterone are associated with aggression, right? And men naturally have that. So you're going to see more aggression in men. That's why part of the reason Jordan Peterson's whole thing about for women to get an equal status in the corporate world, all they need to do is get more aggressive like men. Well, some women can do that, but most women just can't get aggressive and nasty like that. So it's not on an equal playing field. So men are naturally aggressive like that, but a lot of that is deliberately fostered by the culture. So I talked about the fact that I was bullied when I was in school, viciously bullied, and I was physically assaulted repeatedly. I had my nose broken. I was beaten up. I had my wrist broken by a bully in one case. But of all the times that I was viciously assaulted when I was a kid, I was never assaulted by a female, not once. Every time it was males, right? I never once was assaulted by a female. So, you know, there's something different between male culture and female culture. And there are expectations of being male and what it is to be a man. I don't think it's all bad, but it needs to be sort of, in my opinion, balanced. So this sort of vicious, violent culture, I mean, there's a difference between what I would call as aggression and violence. Okay, there's been too much violence associated with male culture over the years, I would argue. No, I don't think that you're simplifying me. I've heard this argument before, actually, truth be told. Nothing would surprise me anymore. Nothing. We live in it. I mean, look what happened with the Wachowski brothers, right? When that sort of all happened, and my knowledge of who and what the Wachowski brothers were and what they represented, when they both sort of transitioned, I went, okay, you guys messing with me? And I think they are. So nothing would surprise me anymore. Thanks, Connie. I try my best. I didn't really style my hair today, though. Yeah, well, I think there has to be, like Prince, it's interesting that you sort of point that out. I mean, what about Prince? I always thought Prince had sort of a neat style to him. Sometimes, like when his more extreme forms, he went too far, right? But if you look at, say, Purple Rain, the fashions that he uses there, and his sort of use of women's fashions in conjunction with his maleness, I thought he did very sort of tastefully, right? That's kind of what I try to go for. I don't, you know, I don't get in for the tutus and trying to be as ridiculous as possible. I'm not going to get into this one. Hollywood is superficiality on stilts, and everybody listens to Hollywood stars. The left, I don't believe in the left and the right. Okay. I believe that all we have is the corporate establishment, and we have different factions within the establishment, which is all pro-corporate, right? Now you look at what's been happening over the years, and, Trudeau slashing pensions and stuff, and the NDP here sort of did the same thing, slashing and hacking away at social programs and stuff. And these are not leftist behaviors, okay? It's degrees, okay? So the corporate establishment realizes that they've got to find some sort of balance. If you let people live in perpetual misery and poverty, they start getting a little uppity, right? So you have to manage them to a certain degree. But at the top of our society, I mean, you look who funds the Liberal Party, and you look at who funds the conservative parties, and these are all corporations, okay? And you actually cover this in Political Science 101 in university, how corporations fund both sides, right? So I don't buy the whole left-right thing. I believe that we have a top-down thing, okay? So we have an elite corporate establishment, and then we got everybody below that. And the people at the top are always looking for ways to control people at the bottom. Yeah, the whole harmless pedophile thing is bad news. And these guys like James Cantor and Orrin Amate and Camille Paglia, who want to, you know, create this notion of a virtuous pedophile, are, in my opinion, engaging in extraordinarily dangerous behavior. We need to protect children. This is clear. And right now, we're not doing a very good job of it, especially foster children, kids with emotional and psychological problems. They're totally being victimized right now by the pharmaceutical, medical establishment in conjunction with their cohorts in government. Intelligence agencies from every company or every country are everywhere. CIA, Thesis, Mossad, MI6, Russian intelligence. That's the whole thing. I mean, that's going to be part of my presentation next week. Okay, so you have to try to remember here what my position is. I believe things get put in media. There's a reason I'm not in the media, all right? Despite the fact that there's been all kinds of dramatic things that have happened around me in British Columbia, like the Oak Bay thing was as dramatic as you get, right? But that was not covered, and none of the mainstream press has, you know, come to me. I mean, you look at what happened with UBC, and UBC getting kicked out of the Pride parade, and there were like, you know, a couple hundred stories at least written about UBC being kicked out of the Pride parade for hosting my talk. And of all those stories, none of them, not a single one came to me for comment. Okay, Megan Murphy says that she's all oppressed and stuff, but I look at all the stories that are written about her, and this Toronto Library thing, and the SFU, then Pan Pacific meeting, and you look at the stories written about her, and over and over and over again, she is quoted at length and interviewed at length. I wasn't, right? Couple hundred stories, radio, television, newspaper, nobody came to me, not one, for a comment. Not a single one. Okay, so there are certain things that the establishment will allow to be looked at and discussed in the public, and certain things that they won't. Okay, so I address SOGI 1, 2, 3, and I address, well, it's not just what you address, it's how you address it. Okay, so I address SOGI 1, 2, 3, big pharma corruption, and the assault on freedom of speech, particularly on social media. And these are things that they don't want discussed, or they don't want discussed in a certain way, particularly in the way that I discuss them, so they don't give me a platform. So anybody that you see getting a platform in the mainstream media, I believe is there because they either serve the elite agenda or don't harm it. I think the whole UFC culture is unhealthy. I used to be, used to sort of like martial arts and stuff when I was young, Bruce Lee and this type of thing. But the UFC, I tried watching UFC and some of the brutality, and it's like, really? Is this the best we can do? I mean, that's sort of making us sort of vicious and desensitizing us to brutal violence. Well, it's more than anti-Christian. It's more of a anti-freedom, I would say. Timothy's getting beat up by women all the time. Well, it's an interesting thing that you say there. So women talk frequently about sort of the hypersexuality of our culture and the fact that all of these expectations are put on them, these sort of role models and things that they're expected to live up to, and sort of the outrage of that. But a lot of these expectations are put upon men too. Okay, and I see women doing it. So women will frequently joke about how long a man can last sexually or how big his penis is. Well, these are expectations that you're putting upon men. I mean, women joke about penis size and stuff like that. The average man, studies have confirmed, is about 6 inches, and yet the average porn star is, 8 inches. So this is an expectation on a man. Furthermore, porn stars can go and go and go and go and go and go, and we know that the average man can go for an average of 3 minutes. But all of these expectations on men have an impact. And what I have found in my interactions with men, in their sort of interest in me, is many of them were felt they were unable to live up to these expectations that were put upon them to be these studly wonder nuts, and they didn't want to do that anymore. So there's, kind of goes both ways. And the only reason the right and the left don't exist in my mind. Corporations, money, and elite influences rule the world. Marxism is smashed by the establishment where it appears. The documentary record for that is overwhelming. Oh, yes, I've got a photograph of George Bush and Bill Clinton out golfing and laughing and having a great time. So that's literal in some cases. The transgender agenda and occultism. Well, this is interesting. Something that I don't talk about very much, but when I was still doing sex work, I met in that time some very wealthy and, in at least a handful of cases, connected men. And one of the men that I met, whom I swore never to identify, so I'm not going to, tried to recruit me for a transgender project in British Columbia that he thought I would be perfect for. I've got actually some screenshots of some of the communications that we had. I've blanked out his name and stuff. It's maybe something I can deal with at some point in time. But he made it clear to me that there was an agenda being pushed and that there was a program to manipulate mass consciousness, basically. And he thought, because of my background in my education and stuff, and because of my apparently sexual libertarian ways, I wasn't quite what he thought I was. But because of these things, he thought I would be a perfect assist for to swear secrecy, which I know what he was talking about. I only agreed never to mention his name. He said that this program I need you to understand, and this was interesting to me because this man was what I regard as a hedonistic atheist. That was my impression of him. Nothing about him indicated that he was a spiritual person at all. I got the distinct opposite impression. He was like a man of steel, wealthy, successful, used to, making hard, tough, nasty decisions. But when he was describing this transgender project to me, he made a very specific point of saying that I needed to understand that what this project was essentially was spiritual in nature. Okay. And when he used the word spiritual, it startled me because this was the last thing I was expecting to come out of this guy's mouth. Right. Well, actually, in his keyboards, that's one of the texts that I have. Right. So whereas normally I don't get into this sort of occult conspiracy type stuff. I mean, even if there was an occult conspiracy, it would be whether it's a cult or whether it's aliens from the planet Zendar, it doesn't matter. It's what they're doing that matters, and it needs to be pushed back against. But there is sort of some ancillary evidence there that this agenda has a spiritual foundation. I ultimately, by the way, was rejected by whoever it was that he was working with as a potential candidate. All they really had to do was review my academic history, and they would find that I'm an anti-establishment man or person. So that was nixed. Anyway, it's just sort of an interesting thing. Yeah, you can see the Wachowski sisters, particularly with Andrew, who's got this sort of gloating, evil trickster smile about him, right, when he transitioned. Generally, when I do my talks, I use flats there, Timothy. So I wore some booties early in my public talks, and I just found they were too uncomfortable. So I started learning flats. So if I have to run, I've got flats, and I can do it pretty well. I was actually chased down the street in Victoria. So thank you. Who published the Great Depression? Well, I think you better just do some studying of the Great Depression. I've just studied that quite a bit myself. I think it had a little something to do with Wall Street, just maybe just a smidgen, and out of control greed. I don't follow the Hong Kong thing perhaps as close as I should. Anyway, so that's part one. I'll probably edit this video for brevity later, take out all of this sort of question and answer stuff. Does anybody have any other questions before I sign off? What have I been on? I've been here for 2 hours and 45 minutes. I think the actual presentation part was about an hour and a half, wasn't it? A lot of people, especially parents who talk about this, think this agenda, it's insane, but they think it's a few isolated individuals and not a coordinated effort. How do you reach them? Well, that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I try to draw all the links and all the connections, and I think people need to understand, and this is one of my theses, is that the transgender agenda is part of a much larger agenda. Okay, so the people at the top of our society are what I would call the ultimate multitaskers. They're also people who, as standard operating procedure, come up with contingency plans. Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, plans within plans, schemes within schemes, contingencies within contingencies. That's how elite planning works. And I believe that's what we have going on here. And there are interconnecting interests. So there is what I would call an elite establishment agenda, and then there's a pharmaceutical complex agenda, which just happens to work in with the bigger establishment agenda, part of which is regaining control of information, because the appearance of social media and digital media has resulted in an erosion of control of the public mind, which they had almost perfected prior to the appearance of social media, really for the most part, over the last 10 or 15 years. Really over the last 10 years, I would say, is when it really sort of came into force. It's now been identified as a problem. And no matter what country you look at, no matter what political party you look at, they're all supporting censorship of social media. They all sort of present variations in how they want to censor that. But a lot of them are two-faced too. So like Maxime Bernier is a good example, who on the one hand is talking about freedom of speech. Meanwhile, back in closed chambers, he's signed off on the Democracy Under Threats recommendations to censor hate speech, fake news, and extremism on social media. Okay, that's because he's part of the elite establishment. We have a real problem in our society today, and I don't know how to get around that. What I keep doing is I try to keep connecting dots and explaining more and more to people as much as I can using quality evidence. And that's one of the reasons I'm so regularly deplatformed and censored, is because if you compare sort of Megan Murphy's presentations, she's got very sort of she doesn't have sort of high-level academic presentations. Her talks are frequently interesting, but she's not a hardcore researcher. Okay, so you look at my presentations, and my slideshow, for instance, is something like 250 slides and countless primary source, record source, academic source citations, right? So I try to build a powerful case for the arguments that I make, and that's why I am censored so brutally. It's because I'm very convincing, right? And because I go outside the accepted range of debate. So I said before, and I said in my last video talking about Megan Murphy, is that it's not so much that I have a problem with what Megan Murphy says and the arguments that she makes, most of which are good and fine, and she does it very well, but she has a very narrow window of debate. And people say, well, it's just about women. Yes and no. Okay, so the problem is that she's ignoring SOGI 123, and she's ignoring the fact that all of these issues have been caused by vested interests, such as the pharmaceutical industry. And you can't just look at symptoms, you got to look at causes. And you also have to have some sort of vision of the future, which Megan Murphy doesn't. So she's talking about all of these violations of women's rights and stuff. Yay, bravo, good. I'm right with you on that. The problem is that while you're focusing on the here and the now, the school system with SOGI 123 is brainwashing a legion of children who, once they get out of school, are going to take over everything, and everything that you've argued for is just going to be eroded because you didn't look at what they were doing with the children. All totalitarian systems know that to shape the world the way you want it, you go after the children. I mean, that's one of the quotes that I use in my presentation, is this quote from Hitler, right? Or Hitler talks about people who disagree with the emerging totalitarian system in Germany, and how he just sort of laughed at them and he said, who are you, talking to adults and stuff, who are you, what are you, you are nothing, you will pass away and you will be gone. But right now, we control the children, we control the future. Okay, you'll pass away, but these kids are already being programmed and brainwashed to see things my way. Okay, that's how totalitarians work. And that is one of the great flaws of Megan Murphy, and why I get so annoyed at her, because she ignores SOGI 123. And as I said in my last video, I don't necessarily expect her to discuss Soji 123 in her talks, but the least she could do is mention somebody who is addressing it and is addressing it in a meaningful and critical way. Okay, it's one of her great flaws. And the fact that she has refused to acknowledge what I'm trying to do in terms of getting an inquiry and stuff, never even once typed my name in anything she's published, never mentioned my name in a radio, TV broadcast or a newspaper, that to me is openly hostile to what I represent, because I know she knows what I represent. She knows what I do. I know this, right? So why she deliberately ignores me is troublesome. And when I see her aligning with Jonathan Kay and what I call the Toronto Cabal and the National Post gang, it's just like, okay, red alarms, red flags, what's going on here? But I mean, I get into trouble all the time for speaking the truth and the way I see things. I don't play favorites. The only favorite I play is the truth. And poverty has all kinds of problems. Unemployment has all kinds of problems. The primary causes of poverty and unemployment in the Western world are corporate greed. You go back to the Depression again. I mean, what caused the Depression? Right? You look at what the Wall Street was up to. Everybody agrees that that was the biggest part of it. Olger had his talk right after Megan Murphy's talk in Vancouver. Yeah, well, what's more interesting with Morgaine is that Morgaine has retreated to this position where Morgaine's completely ignoring my existence again, right? Now he's focusing on Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson again and Megan Murphy, both of whom he's willing to debate. And the reason, and I'm going to be addressing this soon with the help of the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression, the reason for this is that he feels that either he can handle them in a debate, or at least he knows they will not go outside the acceptable range of discussion topics, right? So they won't wander into pharmaceutical companies and stuff like that. Or if they do, they won't have the tools necessary to win that debate. Laura Lynn, unfortunately, is just too easy to dismiss as a Christian evangelist. So that's one of the reasons he is willing to deal with her. Megan stays within a narrow frame of debate. What was interesting about the Megan Murphy thing is that Megan Murphy did her talk at the library in January. Okay, nothing really came out of that talk. There were some protesters, and I was there. I did my talk in June, right? And there was this huge explosion of controversy about my talk in June. And then it resulted in the Pride Society very shortly afterwards saying this is an outrage that UBC allowed me to speak on campus. And boom, they booted them out of the Pride Parade. And then, I don't know what it was, 3 or 4 weeks later, it's like somebody had an afterthought and said, hey, well, wait a second. We just kicked UBC out for hosting Jen. Isn't there something else we're forgetting here? I guess we better kick Megan Murphy out or kick the library out for hosting Megan Murphy too. It's like Megan Murphy was an afterthought after they kicked UBC out because of me. So there's all kinds of interesting timeline things that have gone on. Okay, so the deep state. I would agree that the transgender agenda is being pushed by what we call the deep state. And that's what's, what's his name again? I forget his name. He wrote the book, Economic Hitman. I'm always forgetting his name. But what he called the corporatocracy, right? Although he limits it again. We see this limiting thing going on again. He limits it to corporations, but it's more than corporations. There is an elite establishment, old boys club above that, and there are these academic intelligentsia clubs there too. So the deep state, I think, is made up of all of these, different elements, not just corporations. And they are driving the transgender agenda. I'm not going to get into what I think is ultimately driving that. The whole women thing, part of that is what I call a squeeze and release. I hinted at that at the start of this talk tonight, is that if you want something that's outrageous and you want people to accept something that's outrageous, the best way to get them to accept this outrageous thing is to ask for something even more outrageous, okay? Something crazy, nutty. And what you do is you get all kinds of wild cartoon type villains demanding that this even more outrageous thing be put through. And then you can have heroes come along and battle against these evil villains and get people back to accept this original outrageous thing that doesn't look so outrageous anymore, and get them to accept that. So I think that's what the elite establishment is doing, in part with what's going on with women's. So I think you'll see a return of women's rights in terms of not allowing males to take part in women's sports, not allowing males to occupy women's shelters and stuff like that. Although it's a little fuzzy right now, because they seem to be saying things like Jessica Yaniv is not a woman, because Jessica Yaniv, in Blair White's words, doesn't try hard enough, right? Whereas Blair White and Theron Meyer are presented as, well, these are women. These are clearly women. Can't you see they're women? What kind of a lunatic wouldn't accept the idea that Blair and Theron are women, right? So that gets a little gray there. As far as the Islamic world is concerned, I actually believe the Islamic world is being set up for a fall. So people talk about leftists promoting the Islamic agenda. That's not the left that I've known in my lifetime. Okay, the left, if we roll back the clock, okay, you talk to like Noam Chomsky, or you get back to some of the hardcore communists and stuff, they hated religion. And Islam was their worst case example of a religion, and they hated it. They despised it. It was the opium of the masses, and it had to be smashed and controlled. So what is with this thing all of a sudden where they're saying the left likes Islam? Well, part of it seems to be to demonize the left. The other thing is I think they're setting Islam up, but I'm not going to get into what I think is going on there. But I believe that ultimately you're going to see an assault on Islam, and all of the pieces are sort of falling into place. People need to sort of think about, if you wanted to basically go on a campaign to snuff Islam out as an effective force in human culture, how could you get people into a state of mind to support such a campaign, right? Like, what would you need to do? What would need to happen? It's never been enough. Like, even 9/11, people didn't want to go after every Islamic nation in the world, right? They wanted to go after the specific villains particularly. So, but how could you go against Islam generally? Well, the best way to get people to just hate Muslims across the board is to create a situation like you see in Israel, where the enemy is everywhere, okay? And then all you need are like bomb attacks and stuff like that, and pretty soon you've turned all of Western culture into the West Bank of Israel, right? And then you're going to see this kind of vitriolic hatred for the Muslim community. That's just sort of an operating theory, but I don't think that what we're seeing is a rise of Islam. We see too many comic book characters, I think. I don't buy the whole Sharia law on the ascendancy thing. If it's on the ascendancy, I believe it's being allowed to ascend in order to demonize it. Not that I'm saying that it's a good thing, but I'm just saying that I believe there's a mind game going on there. Yeah, so I talked about this when I did my first interview with Laurel and Tyler Thompson way back when, sort of the first sort of, well, it was intended to be a television interview that I did with her. And I talked about the fact that if you want to reorder society, the best way to make that happen is what you saw in Germany, for instance, where there was social chaos, right? And that sort of was the justification for bringing in an authoritarian state. Now, what do you think if you take the LGBTQ community, the sort of radical, everything goes free-for-all, basically, and you take that and you combine it with hardcore fundamentalist Islamic culture, and you take these two extreme opposites and you put them in the same space, what do you think is going to happen? Okay, there's only a matter of time before they're going to go at each other, right? So beware of that. The right doesn't indoctrinate with truth any more than the left does. Jordan Peterson is a liar. This is easy to establish. Actually, he's one of these intelligence-like liars, in the sense that he does doublespeak, right? And he leaves things open to interpretation. Like he's got different interpretation. When we talk about what a real woman is, he always wants to say, like, he doesn't want to talk about what everybody's always known what a woman is, right? It's a biological thing, right? But when somebody asks Jordan Peterson about a real woman, he'll say, well, it depends. Or like, what do you mean by a real woman? As if we need to start unpacking what a real woman is. And that's that sort of snaky political talk where you start coming up with multiple different meanings for the same word. That way you can say anything to anybody and mean everything to everybody, right? Okay, so the Gnosticism thing. Well, there's this whole tradition of Hermeticism and hermaphrodite and Hermes and all of this stuff. I think I've got Secret Teachings of All Ages. I probably couldn't find Hermes quickly in there. But yeah, there is sort of an occult tradition in sort of the ultimate balance, being this balance between male and female energies. There's something to that. My experience tends to be that most of these people are not literal cultists. They seem to bask more in the symbolism and the psychology of it, rather than sort of the literal truth of it. Should the government be paternalistic towards its citizens? Well, yes, but we set limits, right? Okay. So the government polices its citizens. If one citizen kills another citizen, the government comes in, arrests the offended party, and takes them away. Okay, so there are lines and limitations that apply to that. So yes, most people agree, like anarchy, complete anarchy is not something that most people will endorse, right? People want government, they want protections, and that is giving sort of a paternalistic role to the government. So yes, but then you need to get into sort of a debate about, okay, so what are the limits and what are the responsibilities of the government? I don't use Patreon. I have a GoFundMe account. I think the last donation I got was about 2 months ago or something. I'm slowly going further and further into debt. I should probably look at Patreon sometime, I suppose. Yeah, corporate greed, elite greed, and the desire for power are the primary problems in society. And that's true whether you're talking about North America or whether you're talking about the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was actually, I mean, it's called communist, but it was probably the most brutal form of state capitalism ever, right? people don't seem to pay attention to things in the former Soviet Union, such as the fact that they had, forget what it was called, hero of the something other is one of the highest awards in the Soviet army. And one of the rewards that you got for winning that medal basically was that your children were provided with a free university education. But that's like, okay, wait a sec. This is a communist nation. What are we talking about here? A free university education, right? Well, that's one of your clues that what was going on in the Soviet Union was not communism so much as it was brutal totalitarianism. I would say the same thing about China. So you look at Beijing, for instance. Beijing has more billionaires than any other city in the world. Brutal state capitalism. The government's active to restrict corporate greed for the common good. It certainly hasn't been working in our society. We don't need like, the government is good in terms of regulation. So you don't want corporations dumping toxic chemicals into a river. So they need to do some sort of regulating. The same thing could be said for the way the markets behave. So again, back to the Great Depression, it was the behavior of investors in the market that triggered the Great Depression, right? So you need the government to regulate, but you can't have the government overstepping bounds. And one of the most important things that has to be protected in a free society, because it is the foundation upon which a free society is built, is freedom of speech. And that's why I am so aggressively active in terms of defending free speech and going after these ghouls who are trying to crack down on it. And they want to get after social media. They're saying they're trying to protect the vulnerable. They're trying to protect you by cracking down on social media. Not a chance in hell. They are trying to protect themselves, and I will prove that in my next episode. Yeah, so this is this NDP thing here. This is a perfect example. I actually, when I was younger, I supported the NDP party because, like I said, I've got like a left-leaning in me. I believe that we shouldn't let people starve to death, and I believe in some sort of economic justice, and I believe when people get old and sickly that we shouldn't just let them die and waste away, that we collectively have the power to ease that suffering and be compassionate, right? So I've always had sort of a left tilt in me, which is not to be confused with a communist tilt, okay? I believe in social democracy, basically, socialistic democracy, if you will. But so I supported the NDP when I was younger. But by the time Harcourt and Glenn Clark got into power, it was quite apparent that these people had no interest in what they claimed to stand for. And they just started hacking and slashing this, that, and the next thing, and attacking the common person and putting in policies that were friendly to big government. So as far as I'm concerned, there is no true left-leaning party in Canada today or in the United States. It's all varying degrees of pro-corporate, right? Either really, really, really pro-corporate or not so much pro-corporate. Take your choice, right? Well, the whole currency situation is interesting because, this ability of banks to create money out of thin air and then charge interest for it is insanity. Government, I don't think, needs to be taxing. The government can just create money as it needs, right? At least that's the way I would look in the future. Yeah, I don't say that transgenderism is promoted by Islam. That's not my argument. I believe that transgenderism has certainly been on the rise with Islam in Canada. but that's got nothing to do, like the transgender thing, I don't think has anything to do with Islam. I think that's part of an elite agenda. Again, I talk about the people at the top of society being the ultimate multitaskers. So there's a bunch of things going on right now. I believe that Islam is actually in the crosshairs of the establishment. The transgender LGBTQ agenda, I think, is because we've got these hypersexual liberals at the top of society. And also, I think there may be, and I didn't actually support this idea when I first got into this, there may be some sort of population control thing at work there too. John Perkins, that was his name. Thank you. Yeah, Saudi Arabia is, Islam, I don't think is the way to go. Now, I'm not somebody who says, okay, we don't like Islam, so let's go, kill 500,000 children in Iraq, like Madeleine Albright said was just, fine and necessary, right? That's not me, okay? I think that, I don't want to really get into that whole Islam debate, but I certainly don't support the more sort of barbarian, draconian aspects of Islam. I do have a book here somewhere called The Sufis, which looks at a branch of Islam that actually has a more mystical, peaceful bend to it. Learn from them. Yep, attitudes towards women in Islam, at least fundamentalist Islam, are not good. And again, that gets back to why would the left, who's always sort of been strong supporters of women's rights, be promoting this? Think about that. Jordan Peterson is an elitist. He's a vanguardist. Okay, so people look at the pictures of Lenin and stuff that he has all over his house, and some people say, well, there's proof that he's a communist. I don't think that's proof that he's a communist. I think he's a person who believes in elite rule, right? The vanguard. It's this whole top lobster thing that he pushes. And so he wrote stuff for the United Nations. He's also the keynote speaker at the Trilateral Commission, I believe it was. I'm not really big with labels because that puts me into a box. I'm left-leaning, libertarian. Economically, I believe collectively we have power to alleviate suffering in the world, and why wouldn't we want to do that? But I'm certainly not somebody who believes in these draconian totalitarian powers that the government's trying to seize. They're not real unless you believe in absolute morals. Or if you believe in freedom and democracy. Government has to have limits. If government tries to take too much power, eventually they will discover the power of the masses. Okay, right now the government is dangerously overreaching. This is one of these theories that why they're doing it is not as important as what they're doing. Trying to catch up here. Kabbalah is in Freemasonry. Freemasonry is much more complicated than Kabbalah. Yeah, Corporation, great movie. Everybody should watch it. Watch Manufacturing Consent documentary that the CBC did too. Okay, so you got to be real careful though. So there are certain things that guarantee freedom, like freedom of speech. Okay, if you want to create an absolute perpetual totalitarian dictatorship, you just take away freedom of speech. This is why it's one of the things that needs to be defended most aggressively. I don't know what Peterson is beyond a deliberate manipulator and a deceiver. He's connected to the Toronto cabal, so he's connected to this whole National Post gang, and he's actually working out of an office at the National Post right now, apparently on some secret project. And I cringe to think what this secret project is. But of course, Jonathan Kay comes out of the National Post, and Barbara Kay, and they're connected in with these people like Orrin Amate and James Cantor, who are all part of this sort of insane sort of destigmatizing pedophilia stuff, and you know, yes, transition, but only scientific transition. How power comes from the butt of a gun. I've been reading Mao too much. Good night. Yeah, I'm just shooting the crap right now. Anyway, I'm done for tonight, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I've got all kinds of stuff coming up in my next talk. And just remember, all this Q&A stuff at the end here was just extra. Chat to you all later.